I didn't post it in classroom. Do you want me to post it in classroom? Okay. I posted it in the other class, math, but not yours. Okay. Okay, so just going quickly through sine and cosine graphs. Sine and cosine graphs are periodic or sinusoidal functions. The values of these functions repeat in a regular pattern. These functions are based on the unit circle. So remember, we took the degrees and the y values and we drew the sine graph, the degrees and the x values and drew x values as the y's and drew the cos graph. The sine graph, remembering, starts at 0, 0, and it repeats itself every 2 pi, and maxes out at 1 and mins out at -1. The cos graph, same thing, maxes out at 1, mins out at -1, but it starts at 0, 1 at the maximum, and it repeats itself every 2 pi. So this goes through maximum is +1, minimum is -1, amplitude is 1, period is 2 pi, y-intercept is 0, y-intercept is 1, and it just gives you a little summary so you can go through that. Okay? And then for sinusoidal functions, it says if you have it in the form y equals a sine bx or y equals a cos bx, a represents a vertical stretch by a factor of absolute a, and then b is a horizontal stretch by a factor of 1 over absolute b, right? Because your stretch factors are always positive. That's why they're absolutes. Amplitude, this should be absolute values. Because your amplitude is always positive. From an equation, it's absolute value of a. Period is 2 pi over b, or 360 over b. And then that's just a little summary. Flipping over, it gives you all the summaries of how to do amplitude off of an equation, off of a graph, how to do period off of an equation, off a graph, midline, all of the little summaries. So, for example 1 here, it says you're going to state the amplitude period midline. Midline is a y equals value. Max, min, domain, and range of each of the trigonometric functions. Remember, amplitude is always positive. So amplitude with equations, you're just going to take the absolute value of a and boom, you have the amplitude, right? Really fast. Off of graphs, you can either find half its distance from the min to the max, the vertical distance, right? So you can count up and divide by 2 from the min to the max and get your amplitude off of a graph. Or you can fill it into max minus min divided by 2, take the absolute value of that. The period, with equations, it's either 360 divided by the b value or 2 pi divided by the b value. Or you could take 2 pi or 360 and multiply it by the horizontal stretch, right? Which indirectly, when you divide by b, that's the multiplying by the horizontal stretch. From graphs, you just have to find out how long it takes horizontally to repeat itself. So sometimes that's a max to a max. Sometimes that's a min to a min. A max to a min or a min to a max is half of a period, right? Our midline or our median value, with equations, it's just y equals the d value, the very last value, your vertical displacement, right? With graphs, you can either count up your amplitude and down your amplitude to your midline, or you can literally use the formula max plus min divided by 2. Your d value or your midline can be positive and negative. Your amplitude cannot. If you're going to use your a formula and your d formula, please memorize them correctly. Don't mix them up. I get people doing that on the test, and you get your amplitude for your d and your d for your amplitude. Okay? Max minus min divided by 2 is amplitude, and then max plus min divided by 2 is your midline. Now your max and min values, remember, off of an equation, you can do d plus the amplitude to get your max, and d minus the amplitude to get your min. Remember, that's off of an equation. Off of a graph, you literally just look for the highest value or the lowest value. And then those help you get your range, because your range in set notation is min to max if it's off of a graph. Or you can go d minus amplitude, d plus amplitude. This should be square brackets. That's an oopsie. Domain is XER, or negative infinity to positive infinity if it's interval, unless the domain is restricted, and then they are giving you the domain, so they won't ask you to find it, because that's just silly, right? So you're going to do amplitude, period, midline, max, min, and domain and range for these 3 equations and these 2 graphs. Try it out. And at the top gives you hints. I have it on froze. Okay, so these first ones are equations, and I asked you to determine the amplitude of them. So the amplitude is just the absolute value of a from an equation. So So it's the absolute value of 5. So it's 5. For this one, it would be the absolute value of a quarter. So it's a quarter. For this one, it would be the absolute value of -3, which is 3. Right? So off from an equation, you literally just take the absolute value of A and you have your amplitude. And if you have that memorized, really easy. If you don't, you're going to be doing some math in your calculator. Yeah.
On a test or diploma, like even though you know A is the absolute value, do you still have to put like -3 and then equal?
I always show my work for things like that just in case make an oopsie or something like that. Or like they see an extra little dash and you're just showing them that you know exactly what you're doing.
Okay.
But if you didn't, it'd be fine. Okay, so that's my amplitude. The period from an equation, this is my B value, right? Whatever's sandwiched between my sine and my theta is my B value, and it shows you that on your equation, on your formula sheet. On the formula sheet in the bottom right, it actually shows you the sine and the cosine equations and says what's A, what's B, what's C, what's D, right? So we always do divided by B. So in this case, it would be 2 pi divided by 2, which is pi. Or it would be 360 divided by 2, which is 180. Which one's correct? Whichever one they ask us for, in degrees or in radians, right? And they don't have C values, so we don't know for sure if they're in degrees or radians, so we get both. This one, our B value is 1, so my period's going to be 2 pi, or 360 degrees, because it hasn't stretched. It didn't change. If I divide by 1, nothing happens. This one, the period equals 2 pi divided by 1/2. When you divide by 1/2, it's like multiplying by 2. So it's 4 pi, which makes sense because I have a horizontal stretch factor by 2. So it's going to take my 2 pi and make it 4 pi. Or it's going to take my 360 and make it be... Okay. Then I want you to give me the midline, which is my D value. This one has a +0 at the back. This one has a +0 at the back. And so does this one. They actually all have +0s. Is that the case always? No, these just all did. So my midline is a line, which means you have to put y equals. So my midline is y equals 0 because it's the horizontal line. Horizontal lines are always y equals lines. If I ask you for the median value, boom, it'd be 0. Because it's a value. If I ask you for a midline, you have to give me an equation of a line. So you need the y equals, or it's not a midline. So all of these have a midline of y equals 0. Then I want the max and min values. Off of an equation, my maximum is my D, so my midline, 0. And if I start at my middle line and I add to it my amplitude, I'll get to the max, right? If I start at my middle line and I subtract from my amplitude, I'll get to my min, which makes sense. It can't be amplitude plus D, amplitude minus D. It does not work that way. You're starting at a middle line and you're adding to it your amplitude. That's how we start with the D value. Or you're starting at your middle line and you're subtracting your amplitude, and that's how you're getting to your middle, to your minimum. Oh my goodness. So it has to be D plus amplitude. So in this case, it's 5. And my minimum is D minus amplitude. It's DA, not add. It's DA. If you go AD, they'll have the answer there for it. It's wrong, but they'll have it. Could you not just type that in your calculator and look for your max and min as well? Yeah. If I give you an equation with all variables, though, can you? You could if you punch in numbers for your variables, right? But you'd have to do that. Okay. My domain, I'm going to do interval notation for this one, is XER. Interval notation, then I do set. I don't follow what I even say. Negative infinity, positive infinity. And my range is min to max. So negative infinity to 5, close brackets, because it's equal to them, right? So that's set notation, interval notation. I'm really having problems with telling you what they are. Interval notation, because you don't say the set of. My maximum for this one equals d plus amplitude, which is a quarter. So I'm going to get a quarter. My minimum is d minus amplitude, which is negative a quarter. So my range, if I do set notation this time, it's going to be y such that negative a quarter is less than or equal to y is less than or equal to a quarter YER. And my domain in interval notation is XER. For C, my maximum is d plus my amplitude, which is 3. And my minimum is d minus my amplitude, which is negative 3. My domain in interval notation is negative infinity to infinity. And my range is negative 3 to 3. You have to be able to do set notation and interval because I don't know which one they could ask you for. And you don't know which one I could ask you for. Okay? Now D, I told you one way that you could actually find the period is if you start at the y-axis, pass to min, pass to max, back to that same height, correct? That was one way. Or you could go max to max, or you could go min to min. So if I start at the y-axis for this one, and I go past to max, back to that same height, and instead of going to a min and back to that same height, what have I actually found? The whole period or half the period? Half the period. Because I went from a y past to max, past to max, then I have to go past a min, back up to that same height to get the full period, correct? So if I go from the y past a max back to that same height, I've actually found half the period. Keeping that in mind. So then this is half of my graph, right? This is my midline, because where those two go through would be my midline. So the amplitude is half the distance. So this is my midline up. So my amplitude is 1.5. Then I asked for the period. So if from here to here it's 3 pi, the period is 3 pi times 2, which is actually 6 pi. Then I asked you for the midline. If the midline is the x-axis, that's the line y equals 0. Remember, the x-axis is y equals 0 line. Y-axis is actually x equals 0 line, because that's where all the y's equal 0. My maximum for this one is 1.5, which means my minimum is negative 1.5 because my midline is 0. So it has to be equidistant. My domain in set is XER. And my range in set is y such that negative 1.5 is less than or equal to y. It's less than or equal to 1.5. Y, yeah.
Alyssa's trying to get on the Google Meet.
Oh, now she's trying? I ended it because no one was trying to get on it. So when we go to these ones, it's just stretch, reflect, translate. Stretch, reflect, translate. Just the same as before. The only difference is your translations, you say vertical displacement, horizontal phase shift. Okay? So for this one, I don't have a 1 in front of my x, so I have to take the half out. When I take the half out, I literally just take a half out. So it stays a half. X, and if I go negative 45 divided by a half, that's the same as negative 45 times 2. So remember, when you're taking out a fraction that's less than 1, it actually makes it multiply and get bigger, right? So we're going to get negative 90 degrees plus 15. So our stretch that we have a vertical stretch by a factor of 5 above the x-axis. we have a horizontal stretch by a factor of 2, because it always flips, about the y-axis. Do we have any reflections? Yes. If we have a negative in front of the 5 or the half, we have a reflection. We have a negative in front of the 5, so we have a reflection in the x-axis because it's with the y. Our translations, we have a vertical translation, which we're going to call vertical displacement, 15 up, and a horizontal phase shift, (90 right), 90 degrees right. Now for the next ones, I'm going to use shorthand. So I'm going to do BAFO for by a factor of, yeah.
Just when you're taking the half out,
Yeah.
it doesn't change.
Nope, it would only if you took a negative out. Okay. I'm going to use shorthand. Can we use shorthand on tests? No. The only time we can use shorthand is if it's on your notes in front of your face, right? That's it. Or a quiz that's in front of you. Nothing that I mark or anyone else would mark do we shorthand. Okay? So here we're going to have vertical stretch by a factor of 0.1. I'm only shorthanding so we can get through more of the review. Okay? About the x-axis. And then we have a horizontal stretch by a factor of 1/2 because it flips about the y-axis. We have no reflections because nothing is negative. I have a vertical displacement one down. And then people will write horizontal phase shift 90 left. But what do we have to remember to do? Take out the 2. Because they will always have the answer to you not taking the 2 out. So it's a horizontal phase shift. I'm being lazy. You can't do that. You can't go HPS on a test. 45 degrees left. Okay. This one already, the 0.5 is out. And 0.5 is just a half, correct? And a half is just 2. Right? So here we're going to have a vertical stretch by a factor of 5 about the x-axis. We have a horizontal stretch by a factor of 2 because it flips always about the y-axis. We have no reflections because neither of my stretches are negative. Well, neither my A or B, I guess, is negative. I have a vertical displacement 3 up, which I'm not allowed to write BD on a test. And I have a horizontal phase shift pi left. This one, the 2 is already out. But it's still with the x, because if I distributed it, it would go with the x, right? So here, I have a vertical stretch by a factor of 2 about the x-axis. My stretches are never negative, because the negative doesn't cause it to stretch at all. The negative doesn't make it wider or narrower, or taller or shorter. The negative makes it reflect, right? So our vertical stretch is never negative, even though there's a negative there. We have a horizontal stretch by a factor of 1/2 because it always flips about the y-axis. We have a reflection. Our A is negative, so we have a reflection in the x-axis. You don't have to write SRT. You just have to have it in that order, right? You can just write your verticals to horizontal stretches. You can write your reflections, translations. You don't need SRT. but it has to be in the order: stretches, reflections, translation. We have a vertical displacement 4 up, and we have a horizontal phase shift pi over 3 right. Next, I'm going to give you information and ask you to write me an equation. So here it says, write an equation of each sine function in the form a sine bx minus c plus d, given the characteristics: amplitude of 2, period of pi, phase shift pi to the left, vertical displacement 2 units up. Now it says, what if you changed it up and asked for the sine function in the form y equals a sine bx minus c plus d? I want this in this form. It has to be in this form. Okay? And I should say a is greater than 0. That's my fault. Okay? We're going to do example 3. Example 4 is the same thing, but I don't give you the information directly. I give you graphs. And of these graphs, I want positive a sine, negative a sine, positive cos, negative cos. I want 4 equations for both of these. Okay? So we're going to work on those 2 next. After that, we're going to just go through tan graphs. There's nothing to do. And then we're going to finish off with word problem. Okay? So you're going to work on those. Start working on example 3, where a is greater than 0. The first one, write an equation of each sine function in the form y equals a sine bx minus c plus d, given its characteristics if a is greater than 0. The amplitude gives you a equals plus or minus 2, but in this case it has to be positive because it said greater than 0. We don't have to put on masks. Okay, so this one's going to have to be a equals 2. It has to be positive. The period is pi. I need b. So b would equal 2 pi divided by the period. So b is 2. My phase shift is pi to the left. My vertical displacement is 2 up. So I'm going to go y equals 2 sine b, which is 2. And then I'm going to go x. I need to go pi to the left.
Wouldn't it just be 1 over 2? Or the...
Nope. My b is 2. B is what the equation has, right? Like, so that b gives me what it actually is. When you fill it into that formula, you literally get b.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So your horizontal stretch would actually be a half. Yeah, it's backwards.
Okay.
So in that formula, when we use it, we get b, and b is directly in the equation.
Okay.
Yeah. And it should make sense, too. So normally our period is 2 pi. If our period is pi, that means we horizontally stretched it by a half, which means we have to have a 2 for b, right? And then 2 up. Now, the only reason why I asked this question, what if they changed it up and asked for the sine function where the b is in it, is because sometimes they'll ask for that, and then they'll ask for c, and you'll give me c as pi. But you have to remember that you can distribute that 2 through, right? So this one, the 2 would be distributed in. So we would get 2 sine 2x plus 2 pi, because I'd have to distribute it through, plus 2. And then if they asked me for what c was, c would actually equal negative 2 pi. Or, yeah. Because you need to be a plus sign, right? Minus a minus, which would make it a plus. But this would be like, if this is a minus sign, I need a minus sign in here. It would actually be like that. If they asked you c, c is actually negative. Then for the big kahuna ones. So for these, in order to do this, I have to get my amplitude first. To get my A. So my amplitude is max, the absolute value of max, minus min, which is negative 3, divided by 2. So it's going to be 8 divided by 2, which is 4. Let's check it out. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Do they meet at the same spot? So I know my amplitude's right, which is my A value. And my A just happens to be that it could be plus or minus 4. So that's how I get 4 equations. I can get y equals 4 sine, y equals negative 4 sine, y equals 4 cos, y equals negative 4 cos. Right? And where those two amplitudes meet, give me my what?
Midline.
My midline. So it's at y equals 1. If you don't know that, you can still find your midline by doing y equals max plus min divided by 2. So it's going to be 5 plus negative 3 divided by 2, which is 2 divided by 2, which is 1. Same thing, right? Got the same answer by either meeting where my amplitudes meet or using the formula max plus min divided by 2. And that's going to be the back. Right? Then how do I get my b value? Well, my b value I get from 2 pi divided by the period. And the period I have to get off of my graph. So I'm going to start at my y-axis. So I could go from min to min, do t final minus t initial. So time final, which is 5 pi, minus initial, which is pi, which would be 4 pi. I could go from min to min. I go from max to max. It doesn't matter. They should all be 4 pi. If I start at my y and I go past a min, past a max, back up to that height, it's a distance of 4 pi, right? But I could go from min to min, 5 pi minus pi, which is 4 pi. Or I could go from max to max, which is 7 pi minus 3 pi, which is still 4 pi. No matter what I do, it's still 4 pi. From min to min, max to max, or y past to min, past to max, back. So the period is 4 pi, which is not my b value, because period doesn't start with a b, right? So to find my b, I actually have to use the period. So to get the b value, I use my period. To get my period, I use my b value off of an equation, right? You use them to get the other ones, but they're not actually the answer. So I'm going to go 2 pi divided by 4 pi, and my b value is a half, which is a horizontal stretch by a factor of 2, correct? Does that make sense? My period is 4 pi. It's supposed to be on a normal graph 2 pi. If I'm stretching it by a horizontal stretch of 2, that would get me 4 pi. So it does make sense. If I have a horizontal stretch of 2, my period should be 4 pi, which it is. And then I get these that are all the changing ones. I'm going to do my coses first. To do my cos, my positive cos, I look for my closest maximum to the y-axis. My closest maximum is pi to the left away, right? So my positive cos, I'm actually going to go x pi to the left, so plus pi. Negative cos, I look for my closest minimum. My closest minimum is actually pi to the right. So I'm going to go x minus pi. Remember the sine ones? In order to get the sine values, you draw your midline and you bold the closest intersections, correct? So my closest intersections with my midline is here, and then these two. Right? This one is on the way up, and so is this one. This one is on the way down. So the one that's on the y-axis is on the way down. So that's my what? My negative sign, right? My negative sign's intersection is on the y-axis. So what horizontal shift is that? How far away is it from the y-axis? Trick question. It's none away from the y-axis. It's on the y-axis, right? So my negative sign is done. I just need to put an x in there. My positive sign are the ones on the way up, which are 2 pi away. 2 pi to the right or 2 pi to the left. Which one's better? Neither. Neither is better. What's better is if they said x minus something, then you would use the one to the right. If they said x plus something, you use the one to the left. If they said nothing, I could go x minus 2 pi, or I could go x plus 2 pi, and I would be equally as correct. Yep.
So when you're trying to get the c for the sine function, you take the ones closest to the y, and then whichever one's down is the negative sign, whichever one's up is the sign.
Yep. So if I draw, so I always go, to get my sine c values, I immediately just intersection, 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 whatever my closest are, and then I draw arrows off of there. So this arrow ends from left to right. This arrow is on its way up. This arrow is on its way up. This arrow is on its way down if I go from left to right. So this is my negative sign c value, and these are both my positive sign c values, because they're equidistant from my y. Yeah.
And if one's, let's say, closer,
You would use that one. But they could use one that's further as a multiple choice answer. They'd be mean, but they could do it. Because it would still get you the same graph. Yeah. Yeah.
For the closest, could you also write minus 3 pi and plus 3 pi?
Yep.
Use those.
Yeah, because this one here, for the positive coast, that's a close max, right? It's not its closest, but I could go x minus 3 pi. I could have went x minus 7 pi, x minus 11 pi, and I'd still get it. But they'll often ask for shortest distance. But if they didn't, you could give any of those and be right on a written response. The person marking it will be like, holy, why is this kid doing it like this? But they'll give you the mark for it. Yeah. Okay. This one down here, my amplitude is the absolute value of the max, which happens to be, these are going up by 0.4s, 0.4, minus the min, which is negative 4, divided by 2. So I'm going to get 4.4 divided by 2, which is 2.2. So sometimes the formula takes the brain matter out of it, right? Like trying to count it. If not, you can go, okay, it takes me 4 to get to here, and then another 0.4, so that's 4.4. I have to have half of it, right? So my A value is going to be plus or minus 2.2. So I'm going to get y equals 2.2 sine. Y equals negative 2.2 sine. Y equals positive 2.2 cos. Y equals negative 2.2 cos. I personally like doing my D next, so I'm going to do it. Whoa, those are off. So if I count up 2.2, or down 2.2, if I want to, I can do it that way, which is painful on this one. It's a little harder, right? Counting up 2.2 and down 2.2. So I would just do my midline equals my max, which is 0.4, plus my min, which is negative 4, divided by 2, which is actually negative 3.6 divided by 2, which is actually negative 1.8. Bless you. Please draw better than me. Does that look halfway? Yeah. So this one isn't as easy to count. That's why they give you the formulas as well, because sometimes the formulas are easier. Max plus min divided by 2. Absolute value of max minus min divided by 2. Right? So I have negative 1.8 in the back. To get the b value, I need to have 2 pi divided by the period. And why am I using pi again? Why am I not using 360? Because my x-axis is in radians. And this x-axis was in radians, right? Okay, I'm going to start at 0.8, go past the max, past the min, back up to 0.8. And that happens from 0 to pi. So the period is pi, which is not my b value. My b value is 2 pi divided by pi, which is 2. For my positive cos, I look for my closest maximum. Remember, if I want to know how much the ticks are worth, I have to count how many ticks to pi. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ticks. So this is 1 pi over 6. This would technically be 2 pi over 6 or pi over 3. This would be 3 pi over 6 or pi over 2. This would be 4 pi over 6 or 2 pi over 3. This would be 5 pi over 6. This would be 6 pi over 6 or pi, 7 pi over 6. Right, so they're each worth pi over 6 technically. You just count how many ticks to get to pi. So this one's pi over 6 to the right. For my positive cos, my closest maximum, I'm going to minus pi over 6. My negative cos, I'm going to look for my closest minimum. This is negative pi over 3, right? So I'm going to add pi over 3. Sine's the more complex one. I need to look for my closest intersections. So here and here. If it were me, I would not be picking sine, because this is not nice. This is on the way up, so this is positive sign. This is on the way down, so that's a negative sign. This is halfway between 0 and pi over 6. Right? So that's the distance of pi over 6. Pi over 6 divided by 2, which is pi over 6 times a half, which is pi over 12. So this is actually pi over 12 to the left. And it's going upwards, so it's positive sign. X plus pi over 12. This one is halfway between pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, 3 pi over 6, so pi over 6, 2 pi over 6, so pi over 3. So this one's halfway between pi over 2 and pi over 3. How do I find halfway between two values? It's the average. So I add them up and divide by 2. So I'm going to do pi over 2 plus pi over 3, which gets me pi over 2, 3 pi over 6 plus 2 pi over, I need to add them in the calculator, but 3 pi over 6, common denominator, plus 2 pi over 6, which is 5 pi over 6. Then I have to divide it by 2 because it's the average. And dividing by 2 is multiplying by a half. 5 pi over 12 to the right. So it's x minus 5 pi over 12. If you were given the sine ones, that's going to be a hard question. They can give it to you, but it's hard. You have to find the average between the two, right? Like, that's just quite complex. So if it were me, I'd pick the close ones if I had an option. For your homework, it's to do the written response one on the back, the 2 written response on the back.